Hey guys, we're going to talk about Trikonasana today. So there's a lot of things happening in this posture. It's quite dynamic and we see it very early on in our practice. And no matter what asana series you do, you still have to do this posture. So Ryan's going to demo Trikonasana for us, and the first thing that I want to talk about is the hip positioning, and then we can talk about maybe some modifications or things to work on if there's a hamstring or some limitation that doesn't allow you to catch your toe. So I'm gonna have Ryan go ahead and step out and just set up his triangle, so just do whatever you would normally do. Great. Are you okay there for a bit? Okay, so something that I see often is that this left hip, this left side of the pelvis, wants to wrap in, maybe because there's a tight hamstring potentially, and this is not the correct hip position that we want to work with. And I feel like that maybe when I tell you to push your hip towards the top of your mat, that's not the best cueing, because really what we're trying to access is this top of the hip pushing down. And so one way that I find I can access that in my body is by pushing through the outer edge of the back foot. So he's going to push through the pinky edge of his foot and kind of drag the top of his hip towards his foot. There's also, that we don't talk about very often, a slight posterior tilt, meaning the pelvis is scooped under a little bit. Now obviously if he tries to do that in a dramatic way, he just can't. There's no room for him to do that. But he could go the other way, just don't hurt yourself, and do an anterior tilt, which I see a lot of you do, and you get this back bend happen here if you're really bendy in your low back. Do you need to come out? Okay. So if he does a slight posterior tilt, a little tucking under, a big scooping up of the low belly, and thinking of rounding right here in the low back. So we want a little bit of flexion in the low back here. Then driving energy through the hip, down through the back of the foot, instead of thinking of driving the hip straight towards the front of the mat. Does that make sense? Okay, do you want to do the other side? Well, then I can talk about the arms if you do the other side. And the front leg. Ryan has very open hamstrings. And so what could happen is very easily a hyperextension of the front leg to just jam it straight. So we want his quadricep to be engaged, but a soft, micro bending of the leg. So sometimes that can be done through bending the knee and then pushing through the foot to engage the quadricep and to really tone the leg. The other thing that you would want to avoid is this. This is the most common thing we see, is the spine pitched way in towards the midline of the body. And then to fix it, a lot of times people just do this because it feels like you fixed it. But all you really want to do is pull the spine back to the degree that it's capable, which might mean you have to let go of the toe or bend the knee. Personally, I'd rather see you bend your knee and keep hold of the toe, but everyone's going to need to do that a little differently. So if Ryan had a really tight left hamstring and couldn't catch his toe and needed to hold his ankle, so try that. And then he would be able more easily to access pulling his spine back using the strength of his core. I don't want to see an arm pull way back behind the spine or pitch way forward towards the middle. We want it to stay stacked. Top arm over bottom arm, pulling through the core, low belly in, ribs in, and pushing through the top of the hip down towards the foot. Okay, you can come up. So you don't have to stay there forever. So again, if there is a limitation due to very tight hamstrings or an injury, then certain things are going to need to be addressed and modified. But usually an easy fix is to bend the leg that you have hold of your toe, or in kind of severe cases, you just walk the hand up the shin, being mindful that you're not pushing on the shin to hyperextend the knee, which can be common. And in very unique scenarios, a block might be something that is also useful so that you're not dumping. We didn't talk about that, but a lot of times people dump their weight down into the bottom hand, and you want to be lifting up through the top arm. So can you show that just for a second, and then I'll stop torturing you. So it's hard for him to even do it because his hamstrings are so open, but you see this, like the body wants to go down towards the bottom hand, and you want to feel as pulled away from the floor, like really reaching up through the top arm. This is a huge difference. So there's actually lightness in the bottom hand while it's holding the grip, like almost like you're trying to fight keeping the grip of the toe. Okay, thank you. So I feel like there's like a million things that we could talk about in Trikonasana. Do you have any little things or ways that you experience it in your body?
I would just say, like, sometimes, like, you have, this is like one of these first poses that you have so many different directions represented, and I've talked about this before, of like we have this direction forward and back, side to side, and top to bottom. And this is like one of the first poses, like when we do Padangusthasana, right? It's really a posture that's like top to bottom, front to back, right? It doesn't really represent any lateral planes. Well, all of a sudden now we go to Trikonasana and it represents all of them. And when a pose represents more planes of movement and direction, it's harder to manage because you have energy going in different directions, very much like our life. If we're trying to manage so many things versus if we narrow it down and just manage a forward fold with flexion, much easier. So it's almost like you're trying to manage, like, you know, multiple people, like you become a manager of your body, and you have to manage a body that, like, sometimes if you are in an office and a few people in the office are quite difficult to manage. This happens, like if your hamstring's really tight, it's like difficult to manage, right? So I think the best thing to do is like manage the bigger parts. And I think sometimes we emphasize so much like straight legs, but sometimes it's a byproduct of something else. So if you're like, I'm gonna straighten my legs, well then your spine pitches forward, your arms do that, like, you would want to try to manage most of it. And if one person is kind of on the fringe, then I think that that's better than you have 5 or 6 people like going the direction you want. So if you have to let go of anything, more than likely if you let the knee bend a little bit, like sacrifice a little bit of this, you could then work the spine line, the shoulder, and the hip. And then eventually over time, we're working towards straightening that leg, but it doesn't make sense to be like, okay, there's my base, my legs are straight and strong, shoulders out, pitches out, hips out. Like I'm not sure that that's the best management of the pose. But if we say, watch, the byproduct of me bending my knee a little bit will let me shift my hips, my spine, and my shoulders in great position, my core. That's 4 out of 5 parts that got realigned, and then I can slowly start to work this. That just kind of makes more sense to do it that way. And it's also challenging in that, like, we kind of see the visual perspective, and what we see, like the bigger thing we see in Trikonasana is like that the spine is straight and the legs are straight. That's like kind of what defines what triangles are, which is great. Can do it, but people that can't, where does that leave us? Or even if we have this hamstring attachment, or we've got low back issues, sometimes even having low back issues, if the injury is there, it can be hard to like tuck the tailbone a little bit. So it's all with a like a grain of salt, I guess, that like we have to kind of decide. That's what makes each posture so individual for us, and the teaching in that too. So I would just think of like, how do you get the biggest bang for your buck, and that, like, can you manage more of the movements and potential energy management versus just like, I'm going to do this. And it's kind of like very similar in that, like, Utthita Hasta, right? Like in an Utthita Hasta B, I mean, in some senses, if I took the arm that way, it's like triangle pose standing, right? So sometimes if we're like hell bent on straightening the leg, meanwhile this knee is bent and I'm flexed, but my leg is straight. But if I bent the knee, I could straighten this leg, I could incorporate the spinal connection, I could move into flexion over time. So it shows like what happens in these fundamental asanas is going to get revealed somewhere else, and that's the next place triangle pose is going to get revealed. And understanding the rotation of the hip, shoulder, like it's the same, you're just standing on one leg, which makes it much harder because you're focusing on balancing. So don't underestimate, and don't underestimate like taking the time to really understand these positions. I think it's so important Jamie talked about it a second ago, but just this idea of this, we kind of get into this arching back bend, and we're trying to do that to stack the shoulders and to get the arms straight, right? So then we end up doing this. But this arm position accentuates a back bend. It's like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? I think if you squeeze that, like get that flexion, then you can start to move the shoulders back. But you notice this didn't move. Like this was harnessed and controlled first, then I can start to move this individually. Yeah. So it's not a back bend posture. Yeah. There's very few until you see a back bend. Like upward facing dog, Urdhva Dhanurasana. Like most of the poses in primary series, not all, but most of them accentuate posterior tilting with flexion. Mm-hmm. So just know, like, it's kind of a good rule. Like, you could try to find that in most poses. Even in Samastitihi and Dandasana, like, it's a pitch forward, it's a pelvic tilt posterior. Like, if that's the base of most of our poses, even in triangle, those types of things, revolve triangle, you're still trying to posterior tilt. You're not trying to back bend and rotate. Those two movement patterns don't usually turn out very well. That's when you see in second series and things like that, start coupling back bends with rotation and arm balances and things like that. But in primary, it's just a lot of flexion and understanding movement patterns, and the movement patterns are coupled. They're two parts. One thing happens first, then the other, and they become byproducts of each other. If you put the second one first, it is the saying, the cart before the horse. The cart's not the horse. You've got to put the horse first, and then the cart will follow. So in these postures, the base is there, yes, but if I need to bend the knee a little bit in order to put everything in the right place, you may not be able to do that all in 5 breaths.
No, and I think an important thing to remember is to create an anchor or base, then to expand whatever the exploration of the pose is. But you have to have being anchored first to move from.
Great example. We think, like step out. We think, okay, set the base, turn the foot. So you think this is the base, the straight legs and the feet, that's what you think the base is. But really, your base is kind of here, right? It's the torso, the pelvis. That's really steering the whole thing. It's really easy to get caught up in like, oh, it's obvious, the feet are the base. No, the feet are the base, I'm not arguing that, but really the base of the pose that will determine what everything else does is like right here, right? Pelvis, low back, rib cage, shoulder, hip. And then really, in essence, once we set it up, the legs are kind of following what this does, right? So then in essence, the base is the center body, even though the feet are grounded. Like, I get that, I understand that. It's kind of like the base of Utthita Hasta is your standing leg. Absolutely. But also, what becomes the base? Well, whatever you're going to be able to do with that leg is really determined by your pelvis and your spine. And your shoulders to some degree. So we have to kind of reframe how we're thinking about some of this, and not just, it's not always that obvious. Like, oh, well, the base of triangle pose is straight legs with the feet like this. Absolutely. That's the base framework. But the base of movement, go to the center of the body. You need to understand what the pelvis is doing, what the spine is doing, what the shoulders are doing. That will determine what my arms can do. It's kind of like if I ask you to turn your hand, it doesn't necessarily. But if you turn the shoulder and manipulate the shoulder a certain way, the hand will follow. So it's getting a little bit deeper in layers in terms of understanding. Like, sometimes it is very obvious, sometimes not so much. But once you kind of reframe how you think about it, you're like, oh, that spine is going to determine what my shoulder and hips do. So
part of Ashtanga and primary series specifically is that there's very clear rules and guidelines, and they apply throughout the whole practice, because the majority of primary series is about flexion and forward folding. There's like Urdhva Mukha, Urdhva Dhanurasana, Utkatasana, and Virabhadrasana A are really, and maybe Purvattanasana, like the only places that you're gonna see some mild to very deep back bending. The rest of the time, we're asked to have a slight posterior tilt to ground down through whatever the base and the anchor is, and for the whole barrel of the rib cage to move in some direction. There's not like, okay, now you're extending, now you're doing this. Like, it's actually, once you figure out the formula, it's very simple, and it's applied to every single posture until it's a different shape. Does that make sense?
Totally. So it behooves all of us to kind of learn the rules of like when my arms are
That'll be a different video.
Yeah, when my hands below, I do something. And usually what's beautiful is once I learn the pattern, the challenge is trying to reframe and repeat that pattern in a different shape, but same pattern. So, you know, Trikonasana triangle pose is not to be overlooked. It's a very, let's just be honest, it's kind of an advanced posture. And I think we've done a disservice to just be like, inhale, catch the toe, arms up, and even vinyasa, let alone Ashtanga, right? And don't take lead as the framework to learn the poses. Lead is about rhythm. It's about teaching us how to get out of our mind. It's really like, I think, mental tuning, you know? It's like helping us get beyond like our own preferences and things like that. So obviously you're not going to be able to make 13 different adjustments in lead. So this is about your practice in the MySource studio or Zoom or whatever, but to really like, there's space to transform or change the way we do something. Take time to do that. We have to be ultra conscious in that moment. And otherwise we're just default pattern. Like, yep, I can catch the toe and straighten the legs. Check, move on. Check, you know, and twist and let the hip drop. Like there's so many things that like, if I wanted to change the way I rotated something, I would have to consciously like, oh, my body, oh, it's twisting from there. Most of our twisting postures, same thing. We've got to think about the rib cage pelvis connection. So it's a little bit more than just Trikonasana, but
we go off on tangents.
So worth it. So yeah.
Thank you. I hope that was helpful and more videos to come. Peace.